Hello, my name is Fiona Reynolds, and I'm the middle school principal here at the American School of Bombay. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Judy Willis today. Dr. Willis has one of the rarest combinations of experience that you may find at this conference. She's been an elementary and a middle school teacher for 10 years, and the reason she became a teacher was in order to put into practice her theories on children and learning, because you see, she's also a neurologist. Dr. Willis has written numerous books combining her experience as a teacher and neurologist, and these books help us to better understand what our brain needs to learn. Probably not surprisingly, one of the most important criteria is being emotionally and intellectually engaged. Dr. Willis will show us how this is done in her talk today on how the video game model motivates learning. Thank you, Dr. Willis.
Thank you, Fiona. Okay, thank you. And indeed, I did leave neurology because of what was happening in my patient population that reflected the stressors students were under, and knowing how the brain responds to that, and seeing that these kids were being referred for diagnoses that they didn't have, I had a pool of information that I felt could make a difference in the classroom. And that's what I did. Went back to school, got my master's, taught elementary and middle school, and then for the past 3 years, have been sharing with people like you. So please understand the motivation and how I've taken what I believe, what my interpretation is of the neuroscience. I translate it because I have such an extensive background in the neuroscience. I translate what I believe strongly correlates for educational strategies, parenting strategies, and interventions. So nothing is a direct cause and effect. The suggestions I'll make are correlations from neuroscience to teaching and being with children. And the video game model and motivation is what we'll be talking about. And to prepare for this, while I'm talking over the next few minutes, I'd ask you to get something to write on and write with. It can be electrical, mechanical, your phone, your hand, your finger, but you're just going to need to write 2 things down at one point. Now, there are many causes of reasons for the increasing stressors in education today, and one of them is the overstuffed curriculum. As more information comes in, the practice has been to stuff it in a book. The book gets larger, the information keeps coming in, it's put in a book, it's taught, and it's tested. But there's way too much information coming. It is accelerating. The system is still there. High-stakes testing in many places includes this increased amount of information, and the reflection of it in the classroom through absolutely no fault of the teacher or the administration is how to cope with the amount that must be memorized and repeated. The instruction is not what we want it to be as teachers. There are times when it's frustrating and boring. And when I look at the neuroscience as to times when the brain is in a high stress, you'll see some of the things on this list that correlate with brain changes that I'll show you. Peer relationships, test-taking anxiety, oral presentations, physical, clothing, and language differences, but as I'll be focused on, when students don't find personal relevance. That's not just like, oh, it's boring. This is a brain stressor that changes the way the brain works. Also, the frustration due to previous failure with material or a sense that a student is falling behind. And finally, the boredom when the information being taught has already been mastered by that individual student. So with those in mind, knowing that that was a problem that I was going to be facing in education, I began evaluating what's happening in the brain and seeing what interventions could make some difference. I knew I couldn't change the curriculum or the amount of information taught. So in the brain, there's an area that's an emotional way station, a switching station. And in a brain without high stress, the information comes in the lower brain's attention filter through the senses, travels up through the brain. There's this emotional switching station deep in the limbic system, emotional system of the brain. And when there's not a high stress state, the information travels through to the prefrontal cortex, the area under the forehead where 20% of the brain is the highest cognitive and emotional evaluating brain. And it's only that area of the brain where long-term memories can be formed and where information can be evaluated reflectively rather than acted on reactively. So information has got to pass through this switching station for us to be able to use our reflective brains and to turn information into memory. So that's lovely when there's not a high stress. Now, when the brain is in a high stress state, such as from those things on the list, in the high stress state, that emotional switching station, that amygdala on neuroimaging has increased metabolic activity. So it gets more and more active, and it becomes a switching station that's not going to let information flow through to that higher reflective brain. It becomes a stop sign. Information now can't make it to the reflective prefrontal cortex, can't become memory, emotional input becomes reacted to. No longer do we have control. We have a reactive response. And in animals, this is evident as the fight, flight, freeze response. In a state of stress, the brain instantly reacts. It's very important for the survival of animals. However, humans have not evolved their emotional switching station, this amygdala's evaluation of stress or response to stress, significantly from the other mammals. So in humans, in that high stress state, especially before executive functions have matured in the late teens, early 20s, what we see in children during the state of stress, acting out and zoning out. And that's why so many kids were being referred to me suddenly at an accelerating rate about 13 years ago when the curriculum started getting more and more dense, and they were acting out and zoning out, but indeed did not have neurological problems. That's when I made the switch of careers. So this is just one example to show you what I mean about the memory part of when information can't get through that emotional switching station, it doesn't become long-term memory. And there's also the part about the brain becomes reactive instead of reflective. But in this neuroimage scan, a lot of them average together of middle school students given a memory task, and the scans are taken while they're trying to remember what they were given to remember. The only difference is in group A, there was no intervention, nothing that made them, they were just given the information to remember, and then asked to recall it while they're in the scanner. In group B, they were in a stress state based on photographs they were shown while they're in the scanner of grumpy faces. I mean, nothing horrible. These were kids. Didn't take much to put their amygdala into that hyperactive state. As you'll see, the images you're seeing are kind of bottom up, so the eyes are projecting on the top of the screen. And in the images the A images, you can see the amygdala, the yellow dots on each side, moderately dense in activity because information is flowing through it. But the metabolic activity is also seen in group A, flowing through the tracts into PFC, prefrontal cortex. That's what happens in the lower or normal stress state. Information flows through, it goes into the part of the brain that constructs memory, and indeed, when that group was tested, they scored over 20% higher in the memory testing. And in group B, where they were stressed by this series of grumpy faces, we see the amygdala much more metabolically active, the larger, denser yellow areas, and when the contrast is equally turned down, the metabolic activity is minimal in the prefrontal cortex, and not surprisingly, their scores on the memory tests were lower. So the emotional state significantly affects memory as well as zoning out, acting out when emotional states, when emotional reactions, when there's stress from, as I said, even boredom, frustration, and not finding information relevant. So for me, this took a big leap of faith until I saw research after research, because as a neuroscientist, it's like, no, come on, that's a little touchy-feely. Does it really, is this really going to change the way the brain processes information, or should they just get over it? Well, I was convinced after seeing enough neuroimaging like the one you just saw. And the brain is programmed in mammals, including humans, for survival. So it's a good thing for other mammals that repeated failure, trying to do something and having the experience of not succeeding over and over again, in order to preserve resources, energy, and glucose and oxygen, the brain records repeated failure and starts prohibiting the action that is, it starts prohibiting activities that will unlikely result in a goal. So the brain stops expending the effort when it's accumulated enough experience that shows there's low expectation of success. Good idea for other mammals, problematic in school. So we end up with this fixed mindset that my intelligence can't be changed, my skills are predetermined, limited, and unchangeable. My effort is fruitless. It becomes a repeated process. Neuroplasticity starts embedding that message, and it's going to take some significant change to take that student and switch them from the negative networks they have in their brain to motivation when they've repeatedly had negative experiences. So as I tried to think of intervention, my thoughts were, what is there something that kids do with high motivation and they don't always succeed? And I started investigating the research on video games themselves. So what I'll be talking about is not using video games in education, although that's something I feel good about when under specific conditions. But now the video game model, I'm going to first deconstruct it through the research of others, deconstruct what the elements are in the video game phenomenon, in the model, and then show you how I applied them to motivating students in the classroom or at home. So in the model itself, when you see, if you live with a video game player, we'll see that there's a pull of the video games, that they'll do things that they know will get them in trouble and get them tired the next day, but there's this strong motivation. And the characteristics seen in studies of video game high motivated players, they buy into the goal, even though it's fictional. You can say, what's going to happen after level 10? And they can tell you, I'm going to be emperor of the world. And you can say, really? They'll say, no, but you ask what happens after level 10. So it doesn't have to be a authentic, real, external goal. They're motivated by not the goal itself. And as a matter of fact, failure. Unlike the mindset that becomes fixed in school, if you don't succeed a significant number of times, 80% of the time, in the research of Paul G. and others, they fail. So when they're playing a video game at their appropriate level of challenge, as you'll see, the predictions they make, the moves they make, 80% of them are wrong. Pretty impressive that they use the feedback of errors to improve, and they persevere even though the challenge is increasing and they don't get that success as often as the brain seems to crave. So what's happening? Let's take you through what's actually the deconstructed model. There's goal buy-in, which you'll see in a few minutes. They're playing at their individual level of achievable challenge. That means if they start playing a 10-level game and they can do the required maneuvers at level 1, the game puts them at level 2. They don't have to wait for anybody else in the class or anyone else playing the game to get there. If they already can do the task at level 3, figure out a code or how to balance something, the game puts them at the next level. Now they're at level 3, and they haven't mastered the task. So they're making these little predictions. Okay, I'm going to aim over there. I'm going to switch these this way. And 80% of the time, they're incorrect. But about 20% of the time, they are. And eventually, something happens. They've achieved it. They've mastered what they need to. The screen changes. They're at level 4. And what did they get at level 4? There was no prize. There was no award. There was no candy. There were no hugs. There were no cheers. They're usually by themselves in a room. Yet they are so overcome by this intrinsic gratification that they not only want to keep playing, but level 4, they've gotten to level 4. If it's not challenging, if it turns out to, when they start looking at it, no, this is the same task I did at level 2. Before they even could acknowledge that intellectually, the brain will say, this game is boring. The brain will just want to stop playing unless the level is more difficult, unless it's challenging. So challenge is part, Making predictions and challenge is part of the motivation of a video game. And the pull is dopamine pleasure. So let me show you what I mean. You're going to have something to write on and write with, and you're going to make a prediction. We'll see if your brain needs to know if a prediction you make is correct, because I'm going to make the point of how the neurochemical dopamine and the video game model drives motivation and can be then applied in school and at home. So here's your challenge, and it's independent work, no calculators, no consulting, and you're only going to have like 10 seconds. So it's just going to be to write down instantly what comes to mind. Not the way I would do it with students. For you, 2 parts, 2 things you're going to write down. Would you rather have 1 cent doubled every day for 30 days? The amount of money that you would have if you started with 1 cent and it was doubled every day, the amount there'd be at the end of 30 days. Or at the end of 30 days, would you rather have $100,000? So that's one thing you'll write down. Now this is the challenge here. No matter what you choose, for when you write down the cent sign or the dollar sign, no matter what you choose, you must, to have your vote count, write down your estimate of how much money there'd be if you or someone chose the doubling. So when you have both things written down, the cent or the dollar sign, which you choose, and an amount of money there'd be at the end of 30 days of doubling, hold up your, whatever you wrote it on, I'll acknowledge it and put your hand down, and put it down. So write it down right now, hold it up in the next 10, 15 seconds. I'll see it, kind of, and I'll acknowledge it. Okay, got it, thank you. Yes, good, got it, yes. And by writing it down, you're going to win. So everyone who writes something down will win something. I promise. You'll believe me. All right, so 10 more seconds. I haven't seen that many. Got it? Even if you write it on your hand, got it? Yes, thank you. Yes. 5 more seconds. Window's going to close at the race. You get your bets in, and yes, I love these electrics. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. You held up your choice and your estimate. What you did, you made a prediction. It was even stronger to your brain because you wrote it down and because you held it up. The brain is really struck by the fact that it made a prediction because you did more than just say, oh, I think it's that. The other components that made it strong, such as in the video game, is you actually did something with your prediction. So what we're going to go on to now is the chemical equations for dopamine. Unless you want to know the answer to the money question. Now, you know you're not really going to get the money. I told you you're going to get something, but you know that. And you also pretty much know that it's math. And some of you are not like, oh, I love math, exponential math. But if I said, okay, my time's up, I'm going to leave, how'd you feel? You really want to know. So I'll show you that it's over $5 million. And what you won was feeling the power of prediction. The brain seeks pleasure that rewards accurate predictions. The chemical dopamine, as you'll see, is intrinsic satisfaction. So the dopamine detour, dopamine, this neurochemical that's a neurotransmitter from across the synapse, it has this other whole brain benefit. When it's released out of these synapses in excess, where it's not just needed to carry information, as it is in certain states, then the response of the brain is pleasure. So it's a neurochemical that when it's circulating in the brain loves it. It's a very powerful intrinsic satisfaction. The response to increased dopamine in animals, and including humans, pleasure, increased sustained attention, motivation, and perseverance. Dopamine boosters, movement, enjoying music, being read to, humor, having choice, interacting well with peers, optimism, and the biggest, most powerful stimuli of dopamine release in our video games that we can learn from, the intrinsic satisfaction from making correct predictions and achieving challenges. The video games have that nailed. Making predictions, any individual move at your achievable challenge level, is a prediction because the game has you at the right level of challenge. So you think it's going to go this way, you think it's going to go this way, and you immediately get feedback whether your prediction was right or wrong. And that's why even though 80% could be wrong, you've had the experience of knowing, okay, so I try something else and eventually I'll get it right. You know that you're at the achievable challenge level. And what are you also getting feedback on frequently? You get to know when you've achieved a challenge en route to the final goal. You don't find out, you don't just start at level 1 and not know anything about it until level 10. The screen changes when you've achieved the challenge of level 3. There's a new avatar, there's a new background, there's new activity. The video game model is showing us the brain loves the intrinsic reward of the dopamine release from making predictions and achieving challenges. So it's the probability, the possibility, the brain really loves that feeling, the possibility that dopamine could be released results in the brain wanting to make predictions and wanting to be an achievable challenge rate. So what I'll show you now is just to go through slides, not to show you the strategies. There's plenty you can get to through my website. But the model turned into the classroom strategies is simply to use the buy-in to the goal, making sure the student once has something personal. They're making predictions throughout the class, that they're responding to questions with a dry erase board, that they have the opportunity to find relevance. That's goal buy-in. You know what your goal is, but make sure there's something that they are aware of from the beginning that makes it relevant to them. Achievable challenge, individualizing, letting them know, being sure they have prior knowledge, ideally individualizing each student, which is hard without video learning, to their level of achievable challenge as close as we can, using their learning strengths as entry options, scaffolding, letting them know there'll be a variety of assessments. So showing them, just like the video game does, that there is not just from here to here. Here are the achievable challenges en route to the goal. How can we give them the frequent feedback? Students who see the connection between effort and goal progress, even little, can break that rut of the fixed mindset. We can use rubrics that show them what we'll be measuring and which one. All right, you've never written an essay that you haven't gotten a D on. Look at the aspects of an essay. Do you think maybe in this that you could try just to get less than 3 spelling errors? Because if you can jump from a 0 to a level 1. So they get back the rubric, and suddenly they don't get the grade first. Everyone gets back the rubric, and for the first time, this person sees that they've made progress. They get the real grade afterwards, but they've now seen that effort toward the goal has happened. And there are lots of ways you can find on the website where students can make effort to progress graphs without teacher intervention or parent intervention all the time once you set them up. So the general video game model applied to motivating learning, achievable challenge, awareness of challenges achieved, incremental goal progress, awareness that there's incremental goal progress, not just waiting for the big test at the end of 6 weeks, the building of confidence, the building of resilience, perseverance through challenge, willing to take the risk of participating, and ultimately the growth mindset. My intelligence and skill have the potential to improve, to grow. My effort and practice can increase my abilities. You've seen it in video games. It's raised the bar for what we can do. It's empowered us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Willis.